All righty.
Yeah, that looks good, Graham.
Okay.
Kind of good. Where did you?
Thanks for the patience there.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Well, good morning, folks. So welcome to Township Tuesday, September 19th, 2023. So today we're going to be talking about a few things. So we have a new staff member to introduce. Madeline Cash is the new attorney here at the association. We're going to do a little update on LRIP. And then the winner, as I was checking my email from the last couple of weeks about the most common question, was adopting optional forms of government. So that's what we're going to go ahead and talk about today. So let me see. Now, I did send my little link over to Madeline. Madeline, are you here? I'm not seeing you. I will go ahead and assume that there are some technical difficulties here. Well, in any event, she did just start yesterday, so we're still having a few technical problems on this. Hi, okay, we're going to do it this way. If everyone would be so kind, this is Madeline Cash.
Oh, good morning.
She's the new attorney here at MAT. Madeline, do you just want to say a few words about your background?
Yeah, of course. So, sorry, my computer audio isn't working over there, so I have to jump in here. But I just came from RSM, where I did government work there, and I did government regulations. I helped them with their lobbying information, make sure they're up to date on all their registration information, and make sure that we could continue safely and legally working with government entities. So that's kind of where my background comes from in terms of government. Before that, I was a litigation attorney. I did personal injury and medical malpractice. So I'm comfortable in a courtroom, and I have a lot of experience doing that. So yeah, I look forward to being able to help you guys figure out any sort of questions you have regarding these townships and moving forward with this. So.
All right. Well, thank you. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to shoot them on over to her. Her contact information is up on the website now. So, all right. Update in terms of LRIP. Applications are now officially open. We have a closing deadline, due date of December the 8th. And materials are available at the website on your screen there. So I've got a little screenshot up there so you can see what it looks like. But we've got, updated applications. We've got updated program guides. They've updated the FAQs finally. And then they put up the presentations on how to do these things. So I think this is a good resource for anybody who's interested. So yeah, that's some nice little news. But okay, moving along and jumping right into it. So we're going to talk about optional forms of government today. So what's available, why would you do it, how would you do it, some of the quirks related to each individual option, and then of course, how do you get rid of these things if you decide that you don't want them. So of course, as we all know, that the default structure of a township board is going to be 3 supervisors, an elected clerk, and elected treasurer. And one of the things that is nicest about our form of government is that we are so voter focused and we are so flexible. That's kind of one of the real advantages that we offer compared to other forms of government. Now, one of the ways in which this principle is instantiated into law is through 367.30 and 367.31. These allow us to modify within certain limits that default structure in order to better serve our communities. So each one of these options is given a letter, option A, B, C, and D. And you can do things like you can appoint a 5-member board, you can appoint a clerk and treasurer, change that from elective to appointive in character. You can appoint a town administrator, you can combine the clerk and treasurer, you can do any of these things, you can do all of them together. Now, each one of these offers some potential advantages. Option A, one of the common ways to end up with that is if you are exercising urban powers under Chapter 368, you can be required to adopt a 5-member board. But the other reason that we'll see it every once in a while and somewhat commonly is it's got some pretty big advantages when you're dealing with the open meeting law. Because of course, if you've got a 3-member board, then 2 people together are a quorum, or 2 supervisors together are a quorum, which can be quite a pain. So if you go up to 5, then you need 3 before you need to start worrying really about the open meeting law. So that's one reason that you might want to do that. Option B, appointing clerk treasurer. Of course, this is a way to avoid or mitigate the requirement that elected officials be residents of their district. This requirement comes from Article 7, Section 6 of the Minnesota Constitution. And if you change either or both of them to appointive, then they don't have to be residents of the town anymore. Town administrator. So this is a bit of a weird one. It allows the town to appoint an administrator who's answerable to the board with a specific list of powers and duties. I've never actually talked to a town that has done this. So if you have, I'm super curious. Give me a call. I'd like to talk about how you've how it's worked out for you. But that is an option that folks can do if they're interested in it. And then, of course, option D is combining the offices of clerk and treasurer. This is a way to mitigate without totally removing the residency requirement in Article 7, Section 6. So if you have an electorate that really wants to keep its power with respect to those things, then you can mitigate that by having only one person serve in both roles. So it can be easier potentially to fill out a board if that's the way that you want to go. Now, adoption is fairly straightforward. It is governed mostly by Minnesota statute, chapter 367, though you will find little bits of authority that are kind of hanging out there in weird chapters, particularly 205 as well. But it either begins with a board motion or an elector petition. The elector petition has certain requirements. These come from Minnesota's administrative rules that are promulgated by the Secretary of State, but also chapter 367 of Minnesota statutes. So basically, it has to be at least 15% of the electors voting in the last town election. And then there's a couple of admin rules that it has to comply with. These are 8205.1040 and 1050. That is, it has to be submitted as a whole petition. You can't submit it in chunks. It has to be filed with the town clerk. The clerk must provide the filer with a receipt, and then the clerk has 10 days to verify that the petition meets the minimum requirements, which is to say that they have to find out that you've got your 15% there. Now, one of our weirder requirements, one of the ones that I was mentioning earlier, is the 74-day rule. This is something that falls out of not a township statute, but a county statute, or an election statute, really. 205.16, and subdivision 4 specifically requires that notice to the county auditor and to the Secretary of State be given, quote, at least 74 days beforehand. So if one of these questions comes up, you have to give notice to those people at least 74 days before the election. Otherwise, you got to wait to the next one. So this can be a pretty big pain if you miss that deadline. And then, of course, the town clerk has to provide notice to the voters, both on the published and posted notice of the town election, which has to include the specific language of the ballot, which we are getting to right now. This is actually dictated to us to a certain extent by statute. Minnesota statute 367.31 gives us substantially the wording that we've got to use. Shall option whatever, providing for and sort of describing the option be adopted for the government of the town. That's the formulation that the legislature has chosen. Now, there is some flexibility about this because, of course, for example, option B, providing for the appointment of the clerk and treasurer. Well, you don't have to do both. You can do one or the other. So there is a certain amount. You can modify these a little bit. However, given that this wording is sort of given to us in statute, and this is a pretty direct quote that you're seeing right now from Minnesota statute 367.31. You don't want to get too far from that. You can get in trouble. And then the last bit of sort of administrative requirements related to the adoption of these things comes from the town clerk's report. So when you have one of these questions on the ballot, either to adopt or to abandon a particular optional form of government, town clerk is supposed to, quote, promptly, unquote, file with the county auditor and the Secretary of State a report, and that report has to contain certain items. It's got to tell them the date that you did it. It's got to tell them the question that you posed, and it's got to give the vote. So relatively straightforward, but somebody has got to take care of. Okay. So now we'll just briefly kind of go through some of the quirks related to the adoption of each one of these options. So there are two ways that you can do this. So once you've passed option A, you've got a majority vote saying, all right, we want to have 5 supervisors. We're tired of, we want to be careful about open meeting law maybe, or maybe we've decided to adopt urban powers under Chapter 368, and this is one of the things that we have to do. There are 2 broad methods. So you can either hold a special election, and those have to be one of the listed dates. So second Tuesday in February, second Tuesday in April, second Tuesday in May, etc. If you do that, then the new extra supervisors serve only until the next town election. At that point, both positions go up for election. One is a 3-year term, one is a 2-year term. This is so that you don't end up with these great big pileups of people running at the same time. If you are not exercising powers as an urban town, you can choose to wait until the next annual town election. And then once again, you're doing the 2-year, 3-year thing as a way to keep terms rotating. Now, one of the interesting bits about Minnesota Statute 367.33 is that it does use the word, quote, exercise, unquote, of urban powers. So even if you adopt these things, you can, to a certain extent, control the date upon which you have to have one of these special elections by declining to actually use any of the powers until you're good and ready to have a special election. So that's one thing that you can do to kind of mitigate some of the harshness of that. If you've decided to adopt urban powers. Okay. Now, of course, option B is probably the most common one that we see here at the association, just as a way to sort of mitigate the harshness of Article 7, Section 6. If the clerk or the treasurer or both are no longer elected offices, but are indeed appointed offices, then you don't have to restrict yourself to residents of the town specifically. So what happens then, if you had your election, you've adopted option B, then the elected office expires when the term is up. So it's not automatic necessarily. There's a little bit of a grace period. For example, if the clerk's position is made appointed in an even number year, like when they are elected, then that's nullified and you get the power to appoint immediately. But if it's an odd number year, you have to wait for their term to expire. And then after their term expires, or perhaps if it becomes vacant through some other means, then the board gains the power to appoint. Option C is the weird one of the set. So the language of the relevant statute in Chapter 367 says, quote, as soon as practicable, unquote, the town board shall appoint an administrator upon the terms it deems advisable. Now, this person serves the pleasure of the board, though there is a bit of a caveat to that. If they have been in office for more than a year, then they get to demand a public hearing and written charges before they can be fired. So that can get a little awkward. But they have sort of a statutory list of powers and duties. Basically, they're supposed to execute the town's ordinances. They're supposed to recommend appointment, suspension, removal of employees. They're to provide for town purchases, of course, consistent with other state laws related to government finance, preparing an annual budget, presenting that to the town board, attending meetings, stuff of that nature. It's a little bit like towns having a mayor almost. But like I said, I've never actually spoken to somebody who has attempted this. So in practice, I think this one's pretty rare. Okay. And then option D, which is what happens if you combine the clerk and treasurer. Generally speaking, we'll see this one when the voters decide that they would like to hold on to their power to elect officers, but they recognize that there's some difficulty in finding folks. So, we're going to go ahead and mitigate some of the difficulty posed by that residency requirement by requiring only one candidate to stand instead of 2 candidates to stand. one of the odder bits of this is that it's the treasurer who gets kicked out. So if you adopt one of these things, the treasurer gets to continue until their term, until their office becomes vacant or their term expires, at which time they lose their job and the clerk becomes the clerk treasurer. Even if this thing is adopted during a year when the treasurer themselves was getting reelected, then that election is a nullity. The office is vacant, and they become combined clerk treasurer. Now, one of the more annoying aspects of this particular one, if you decide to go this way, is that you have to have an audit if you do this. Now, the legislature, in its infinite wisdom, has set a line. That line is $150,000 in 2005 dollars, but adjusted for inflation. And if your revenue is below that line, then you have to have an outside audit once every 5 years. If it's more, then you have to have it every year. Okay. So what happens if we've decided that we tried one of these things, we think it's garbage and we want to get rid of it? Well, that process exists in law as well. There's a limit. You have to do it later than 3 years after the adoption. So if you try it, you can't get rid of it immediately. There is that 3-year timer that has to expire before you can get rid of it. But otherwise, the process is basically the same. You start with a board motion, you start with an elected petition. It's just that the question is, shall option, say if it was option A, shall option A be abandoned for the government of the town? And otherwise, the process is the same. So we still have our 74-day rule, we still have our petition requirements, we still have all that stuff of that nature. All right. Let's see. So, are there any questions here? Let's see. Okay.
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
Is it possible for a town to, in effect, adopt a contingency resolution? Example, if the clerk or the treasurer race does not get any candidates, that would enable them then to appoint a person to fill that office who may or may not be a resident of the township. If they get candidates that file, then they would remain elected. If they do not get candidates, would they have an option then to appoint?
I would take the view that would probably not be effective, because we have our dictates on the language that has to be used. There's no provision for sort of doing this on a contingent fashion. That said, there are certain workarounds depending on how much work you're willing to do. So, you could pass a resolution supporting something like that, and then if you don't get questions, or if you don't get anybody to actually stand, you could do this as a special election technically, but of course that's a ton of work. So I'm not sure that you'd want to do it that way. But if you submitted the question as, if no one stands, then we would like the power to appoint, I don't think that would be effective per Minnesota Statute 367.31. Great question, though. All right, let me check the chat here. If your option B, the clerk or treasurer does not have to live in the township, that's correct. Here, hang on, let me see if I can lay my hands on the reason for that. Just a moment here. So I'm gonna, oops. Go ahead and share my screen here. Once again. Alrighty. So the reason is Article 7, Section 6 of the Minnesota State Constitution, right here. Every person who, by the provisions of this article, is entitled to vote is eligible for any office elective by the people in the district wherein he has resided for 30 days previous to the election. So when the office is elective in character, the Minnesota Constitution kicks in and says you have to have resided in that district at least 30 days previous to the election before you are allowed to stand for office. If you change the character of the office to appointive, then that doesn't apply, meaning you can appoint somebody who does not live in your town. This is what makes option B probably the most popular option, I would say, in terms of optional forms of government, just because it makes it a lot easier to find folks to serve in these clerk and treasurer roles. Now, there is no equivalent for the supervisors. Supervisors have to live in the township, no way around that one. But you do have this option to potentially mitigate the impact of Article 7, Section 6. Now, that does have, there are some weird, I don't know, caveats to that, because there's also, of course, the vacancy process, Minnesota Statute 367.03, which also can result in quote unquote appointive clerks and treasurers. Those people still have to live within the township. If you're filling a vacancy, yes, they still call it appointive. No, that one doesn't get rid of the residency requirement. Option B is the only way to sort of permanently get rid of that residency requirement for clerks and townships. Is township administrator in place of clerk or plus clerk? So that's a great question. You can appoint the clerk as the township administrator if you want to, if they're qualified. But you don't have to. They really are kind of, they really can be anyway, like this kind of extra township officer that only exists in this option C context. So if the clerk is qualified, they can be the administrator if they want, if the board thinks that person is the right person for the job. But you can kind of have a town mayor, for lack of a better term, and that person does not have to reside in the township because it's appointive and not elective. That person is answerable to the board, but it's its own weird little beast. So, great question. Sorry about the presentation size. I was trying to monkey with that as we were going along. This will be available on our website afterwards if you'd like to take a look. I'll try to fix that issue. Apologies for the difficulty. All right. Any other questions, Gussie?
I have one, Graham. Yeah. Now I missed this because I had another Zoom meeting, county board Zoom meeting. But so my question is something that I just saw flash by when I got in there. How do you get rid of somebody who is not elected? I mean, they're an at-will employee. Is that correct, as a clerk? So is there a process? Because I know a lot of clerks I've talked to talk about, well, they're probably just going to get rid of me. They don't like what I'm doing. How does that work? I don't know what to say to them.
So it's so once you've adopted option B and they become appointive, then they're basically employees at that point, and they can be fired like any other employee for good reason, bad reason, no reason at all, except of course you can't violate anti-discrimination law. You can't fire somebody, for example, for exercising their First Amendment rights. So there are certainly limitations on how and when particularly a public entity can fire somebody. And that's something that we talked a bit about that last time in terms of sort of the general limitations on the at-will employment doctrine. We'll do a further one if folks are interested in terms of the additional limitations placed upon government. Because of course, since we're government, there can be circumstances in which due process is required. Usually not. There can be circumstances in which you can't do it for if somebody's complaining about clearly First Amendment protected matter, like that township supervisor is doing a bad job. That can be dodgy. You could be infringing upon somebody's right to free speech if you try to fire them for something like that. But in general, at-will is going to apply. So no specific procedure really. You can be fired for good reason, bad reason, no reason at all is the traditional formulation.
Thank you.
If officers are appointed, are they normally appointed for a given time or simply appointed until such time as they resign or are released? That's a great question. So one thing that I didn't really draw out in this presentation is the difference between the two different kinds of appointed offices. So it's possible to have somebody appointed for a term or a quasi-term. That is, if I am, the town clerk and I have a heart attack and die, then my office is vacant, and you guys need to appoint somebody. The town board. This comes from Minnesota Statute 367.03. It says the town board, quote, shall, unquote, appoint somebody. Now that person is appointed until the next township election, or under certain circumstances, they can be appointed for the full term. That's what you might call like quasi-appointed or sort of appointed. If you go into the full option B process, then terms are indeterminate. So they're appointed until the board doesn't like them anymore.
So one other question, Graham. Now I was a clerk and I was a deputy clerk for another township. That township clerk had a stroke. And because I wasn't from that township, he remained the clerk until they could change that option to appointing that clerk. Is that a good option to go that way? I mean, they found it worked for them, and then I was able to get that on the ballot for them.
So I would recommend that process to towns that are sort of in transition, one way or another. So if you're dealing with somebody, if somebody's retiring and they just don't have the capacity to be the clerk anymore, then they can leave their name on the office, so to speak, and then you can appoint a deputy who, of course, doesn't have to be a resident. And then, that person can actually do the job while we're waiting for option B to kick in. So if any of you have called me about this, I usually call that the short-term solution versus the long-term solution. And I think it is a good idea if you're in transition. I don't know that it's a great idea to leave it that way forever, but that's sort of a matter of judgment. It's not illegal. You could do it forever if you wanted to. I think as matter of administrative tidiness, I tend to prefer going with option B rather than leaving somebody deputy forever. In terms of downsides, if you leave somebody deputy, their term is dependent on the primary's term. So if you're in a situation where the primary, they have a stroke, but they're still alive, they can technically discharge their duties. They're still around. But if they actually die, then their office is vacant, meaning your deputy is going to get kicked out. So you don't have anybody at all at that point, and the supervisors need to pick up the slack. So that's one reason to move to that option B sooner rather than later. But at the end of the day, it's a judgment call. It's not required in any deep way.
Thank you.
Pat, in option B, do they have to say the oath every year? They have to take the oath before assuming office. So I would take the view that they have to, once they get their certificate of office, they have to file their oath. And then I don't think they would have to again, because we're dealing with an indeterminate term. So it's one term stretching over time, not like new terms being renewed every couple of years, as in the case of an elective office. I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking it, when your term would have expired. It's the kind of thing that has no downside and is pretty easy. So you might want to do it out of sheer belt and suspenders conservatism. But I wouldn't take the view that it's required. Okay. Well, folks, thank you for your time and your attention. I hope that was helpful, at least mildly interesting. In any event, if anybody's got any other questions, feel free to sing out. Otherwise, I will see you next Township Tuesday. And thank you and have a nice morning.